Hi and welcome. In this video I am going to show you how to achieve the rusted lock look using watercolor pencils. So I am not going to review any watercolor brands. It's just a simple tutorial using student grade watercolor pencils. So hello and welcome back to Run My Arts watercolor tutorial series. So it has been a while since the last I made a tutorial using watercolor pencils. So if you are new to watercolor pencils, you can check out the basics of watercolor pencils as well as a simple tutorial of painting this bird of paradise. I have left the link in the description. So I will be demonstrating this painting on Canson XL cold press watercolor paper, which is of 300 grams per square meter and the size is A5. And if you're interested to download the sketch of this padlock, I have posted it on my Pinterest account. Link is in the description. So I have filtered out the colors that I'm going to use for this particular painting, and mostly it's going to vary from brown shades and a little bit of blue and green shades, which is going to indicate the copper corrosion staining on the lock. And just a quick show of how these shades, watercolor pencil shades, look like on the watercolor paper before I move on to the tutorial. So these are basically the brown shades, and I'll be using a little bit of black, not too much, but towards the ending of the painting process. And a close view of the blue and green shades as well. And just sharing with you the reference photo that I used in order to paint this lock. So unfortunately I do not have the official link to the reference photo, but I'm just showing you just in case you're wondering how do I go about this painting. So to kickstart, I am going to use a gray shade to indicate the steel color, which is usually silver. So I'm just painting the first color wherever I see a lighter shade. So in regular watercolor painting, we usually kickstart painting using the lighter shades and gradually layer with darker shades as we progress in the painting process. So the same concept applies to watercolor pencils as well. So even though a rusted lock or any rusted material appears to have very dark shades, as in copper color, some red shades or burnt sienna brown, yet there are still some patches of light colors as the original material was silver or light gray in color. So in order for the lighter color to show, I am painting using all the lighter shades, which range from the gray to blue and green shades. So basically that is how watercolor paints work, whereby they are transparent in nature and less opaque compared to gouache, oil paint or even acrylic. So you will have to start painting the lighter shades if you want some light areas to show at the later stage of your painting, instead of start painting the entire subject with very dark shades, because you won't be able to save the watercolor painting by layering in the lighter colors at a later stage. Alright, time to wet the watercolor pencil pigments and do the painting process. You don't need too much of water since you have already layered the pigment, so a damp brush would do. So from the shine that's been reflected by the water, you can notice that there's not much water on my paper, which is why I said it is important to use a damp brush instead of a very soaked wet brush in order to have a proper control as you paint those pigments. So I'm satisfied with the look of this stain on the lock. I'm going to use the same color mix onto the other parts of the lock. So if you are painting based on a reference photo as well, you don't have to be very precise about the markings on these paintings. as long as you have decided the coordination of where those light patches are supposed to appear. Done with the gray shade, I've moved on with the second color, which is the bright blue. Once again, just layering them just the same way as I did on the hook or the holder of the lock. Moving on to the third color, which is the brightest green. I've also started using an additional shade of green, which is slightly darker than the earlier green, just to add some color variations. Alright, it's time to apply the washes. Once again, use a damp brush. And since there are more pigment on this part of the painting, you may want to be more mindful with your brush strokes. What I mean is, you will have to control your brush strokes and not move them too much if you do not wish to stain the lighter area with a darker pigment. So usually you do not face this type of issue in a regular watercolor paint because the paint is already on your brush bristle. But in watercolor pencils, you have pre-stained or pre-applied those pigments onto your paper, whereby when you start re-wetting them, they tend to bleed onto other parts of your painting. So before we move to the next layering process, make sure the first layer is completely dry. And I'm going to kickstart by using the yellow ochre since it has a golden hint in its shade. Since the yellow ochre falls under the lighter shade category, I'm going to give it some light washes before I proceed to layer more darker shades. Alright, time to layer in those darker shades, and before you proceed, please make sure the painting is completely dry. Just a quick show that this is the yellow ochre shade that I used earlier. So next I'm going to proceed with the dark brown shade as I'm showing here. So after the washes, I realized I needed more brown shade onto the hook of this lock. So I have extended a darker brown shade which is similar to a burnt sienna. And as I color, I am also trying to define some shapes as in dark areas or shading to enhance the look of this lock as in a 3-dimension and a more realistic look. So I am going to repeat the same process using the same brown shade onto the main body of the lock. And you can notice here that I'm making more intense shapes or marks to indicate the rust particles on the surface of the lock. Alright, time to make more intensive marks on the rust area. I'm using burnt umber or sapphire. So this step is quite crucial because the dark patches that I applied are supposed to remain as marks or patterns on the surface of the lock. So you don't want to blend in those dark colors. So have some brush control. As I mentioned earlier, you don't want these colors to blend in and it has to remain as patches to represent the rust marks. Now I'm extending the burnt umber or sapphire color onto the hook. And since this is a darker shade, as I said earlier, I am going to focus on intensifying the dark areas as well as some basic shapes or marks. Time to use black for shading as well as making hardline marks. So in order to maintain those hard marks, it is best to use a smaller bristle brush like what I'm using over here, because this will help to maintain the look of those marks and patterns that you have made while re-wetting them. So I have extended the black watercolor pencil to intensify the look of the marks, similar to the one that I did on the hook. Layering more burnt umber to darken some part on the body of the padlock. So since these patterns or marks are of larger size, I am reusing the round brush so that it will be easier for me to wet them and give them some light washes. As for the narrow areas or fine lines, I am reusing the smaller brush to help me maintain the look of those patterns. So in order to brighten up the entire look of this padlock, I am extending an orange shade, and I'm just applying a bit here and there onto the hook as well as the body of the lock. However, I am not going to make any more washes this point forward, which means this is going to be the last or final step of this entire painting process, and I'll be extending some other colors moving forward. So keep in mind that in order to brighten up your painting, when you use watercolor pencils, you can make final touches, as in just coloring onto the dry surface of the subject and just leaving it as it is, and there is no more washes required. Apart from coloring, more fine tuning by making more marks and patterns. Now for shadow, I'm using the same light grey mix that I used earlier in this painting, as well as navy for the darkest part of the shadow. Just making some random marks using some of those brown shades to indicate some splatter. As I re-wet them, they will definitely look very loose. So the last step is optional, whereby if you want more highlights, you can just use the white shade. However, you will have to wet the tip of the white color pencil, and apply onto areas where you foresee some popping highlights. Alternatively, you may use white gouache, pastel, or even markers. There are a lot of white markers in the market where you will find it much more easier to apply it as a finishing touch. And with this, the painting is complete. So if you liked this tutorial, then do hit the like and share button, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and do hit the bell icon in order to get latest updates from my channel. So thanks a lot for your support. I'll see you again in the next tutorial. Bye.